second peat. Thanks for coming to our second Peat Metal webinar. Today we're going to hear from Richard Fewster, who's going to tell us about the project he's working on at Queen's University Belfast. He is currently working as a research fellow there, but previously he's worked at University of Leeds and University of Exeter with an interest in permafrost peatlands and Arctic peatlands. But he's not talking to you about that today. He's going to talk to you about the Pipes project. So over to you, Richard. I will stop sharing.
Thanks, Emma. First task is to make sure I'm doing this correctly. There we go. Oh dear. No. We'll get there. Right. We practiced this about 2 minutes ago and it worked fine. Always the way. There we go. Right.
Yeah, I can see the PowerPoint now.
Is that all working now? Okay.
That's perfect.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Emma, for the introduction. And thank you, everybody, for joining today. It's great to see so many of you. So yeah, as I've been introduced, I'm Dr. Richard Fewster. I work at Queen's University Belfast. And I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about our research, where we are trying to unravel some of the toxic secrets that our peatlands may have. So this is an overview of a Leverhulme Trust-funded project, PIPES, which is an acronym that stands for Pollutants in Peatlands, from Sink to Source. So this is just a brief overview of the talk. It's going to be around 30 minutes. I'm going to introduce you to the internal team here at Queen's University Belfast, which is working on the Pipes project, then provide some context and background for our research questions, and then an overview of our methods, study design, and some information on how you may wish to get involved or provide feedback or advice to us, as this project is still very much just really getting started into its analysis stages. So here at Queen's University Belfast, this is the internal team that's really leading the way on this project. So this project, the primary investigator is Professor Graham Swindles, who is an Earth system scientist. And then there's two sort of core components of this project. I myself am leading the first component, which is a core-based paleo-focused component of the project. And as Emma's introduced me, I'm a peatland scientist, generally interested in past and future environmental changes in our peatlands globally. And I also have a strong interest in paleoecology. The second component of the research is much more experimental, and that's led by our senior research fellow on the project, Dr. Sophie Green, who is a soil biogeochemist. So that's the sort of core group at Queen's. But the real strength of this project is that it is very much a collaborative endeavour. We're collaborating with a range of different institutions, and we've been really grateful for the uptake and interest that so many of you watching and so many others have had in our projects. And on the screen here are just a few examples of the institutions that have been involved with us. This group is growing by the week. We've had 5 or 6 additional cores arrive this week, so I haven't added everybody here, but the real key point is that Pipes is very much a collaborative endeavour, and there is still opportunities for you to get involved if you would like to help us out with this. So onto the sort of the context and the background for our project. This is peatlands are changing. Peatlands are changing rapidly. This is a picture that is very close to my heart. It is a picture of a study site that came from my PhD. And as Emma said, I used to study and still do study permafrost peatlands. And the picture here shows the dramatic changes which we're seeing in these systems. On the left-hand side here, we have a raised permafrost pausa. So this is a frost mound which is raised, has very dry surface vegetation of lichens and mosses. And as you can see in this image, even within a few meters, we're seeing dramatic shifts whereby parts of this peatland are cracking, collapsing, transitioning ecologically and also hydrologically to the right-hand side of this image, where we're seeing a shift from a dry permafrost peatland towards very wet, inundated fen vegetation. And these changes are driven by climate change. And here's a couple more pictures from the site that I studied in my PhD in Stordalen in Abisko. And as you can see here, we've got changes rapidly happening in our sites, including thermokarst, so the development of ponding, inundation in these sites, subsidence, which is causing a rising of the water table relative to the surface, which is causing ecological changes, and cracking and structural collapses. So yeah, I couldn't resist throwing a few permafrost peatland pictures in here just because they're very close to my heart. But the real key point to take away here is that climate warming, climate change is driving rapid and potentially irreversible changes to our peatlands. And as you can see from these pictures, anything that might be stored within the peatland, particularly in those near surface layers of peat, are likely to be affected. But it remains uncertain exactly how these layers and what consequences it may have. But it's not just in permafrost peatlands, and I've been very interested to expand my research to our boreal, temperate and tropical regions, which is a fantastic opportunity that PIPES offers. It is very much a global project studying peatlands from all different perspectives. And peatlands globally are facing multiple threats. Climate warming in more temperate regions, for example, in many parts of Europe, is leading to a drying trend in our peatlands, causing surface desiccation, in many cases causing the removal of surface vegetation, cracking of the peat surface, and thereby increasing the likelihood of erosion and gullying. And these sorts of images from the UK demonstrate how near surface peats are being rapidly destroyed and eroded and exported from our sites. But again, it's not just climate either that is driving changes in our peatlands. Anthropogenic changes and disturbances are also damaging peatlands globally. The most notable changes are the increased incidence of fires and burning in peatlands, but also in parts of Europe, particularly in parts of Ireland where we work here. Many of the peatlands in this region have been cut in the past for peat to be used as fuel and drained in other parts for agricultural purposes. So there's a range of different disturbances, both anthropogenically driven, but also climate driven. And it's clear that these changes are damaging our peatlands and unlocking the stores, anything that is stored within the peat. Now, much of the research in recent years and decades have focused on carbon and the changes that these disturbances will have related to the carbon cycle and the carbon balance of global peatlands. Peatlands represent one of the world's largest terrestrial carbon stores, but there is also a sort of a more hidden, maybe less well-studied factor which I want to talk to you today, which may also be threatened by these changes. And that is this question at the bottom here. Do peatlands potentially also represent important global pollutant stores? And if so, is there now an increased risk of release following the climate and anthropogenic perturbations that we're seeing in these systems? So that sort of sets up the general context. So our project really focuses on pollutants in peatlands. We know that peatlands, for many years, it's been well documented that peatlands have the potential, particularly on batrothic sites, to accrue toxic elements, pollutants over time. These include heavy metals such as lead and copper, metalloids and organic pollutants. We're interested in pollutants in peatlands because even the very small concentrations, even exposure to very small concentrations of these pollutants can cause vital and damaging health complications, including neurological conditions, infertility, respiratory conditions. But also if these pollutants are released into drinking water, it can impact not just humans, but also animals and ecosystems. So there can be a wide range of health implications and damaging consequences that can occur as a result of the release of even very small concentrations of these heavy metals. Now, peatlands have been accruing these elements via various deposition pathways over the past few decades, following the Industrial Revolution in many parts of the world. So one particularly potent or important mechanism whereby peatlands can accrue heavy metals is through atmospheric deposition of particulates and ash. And that is most commonly occurring in our obentrophic sites, which are atmospherically, which are very much isolated from local hydrological flows. But fens and other minerotrophic sites may also be polluted by incoming contaminated water supplies. Now, when our peatlands are intact and in a stable state, it's not necessarily a big issue that pollution and pollutants are landing and being deposited in our peatlands. Over time, new vegetation growth will eventually bury the layers of pollutants and particulates and essentially lock up this pollutant store in the peat layers. And essentially, the peatlands act as a pollutant sink. However, as I've already shown you at the start of this presentation, I wanted to make it very clear, our peatlands are very much not in an intact, stable state, and many peatlands across the world are now being damaged and threatened and changing state, and these rapid, irreversible observed changes pose this urgent need for further research into the potential that this gradually, slowly accumulating pollutant store may now be at increased risk of release. And that's the real focus of the PIPES project. So far, this has been relatively theoretical, but I want to show you sort of some of the ways that we can actually quantify that pollutants are accruing in peatlands and have been in recent decades and years. So there's a number of affordable and easily applicable methods we can use to measure pollutant levels and the concentrations of different elements in peat soils. We can use inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry, ICP-MS, which is quite a destructive method, or we can use non-destructive X-ray fluorescence analysis. And a number of other techniques exist too, but these techniques allow us to build up profiles or stocks of the elemental composition of peat soils. This here is a depth profile, a geochemical profile taken from a paper by Graham Swindles in 2016, and it's just a typical example of a UK raised bog in Swarthmore in Yorkshire. And as you can see towards the top of the profile, there's been a very much a distinct increase in a range of different heavy metals and metalloids, particularly during the last few years, particularly during the last 100 years or so. This is very much indicative of an anthropogenic industrial source and suggests that the increase in the pollutants in this site are associated with increased industrial activity nearby. And in some cases, we can even see this visually in the field. So this is a core that is taken from the Northern Pennines. And on the right-hand side, that's the sort of the top of the profile. And in many cases, we can see much darker layers towards the top of our peat cores, which are generally indicative of increased particulate deposition. And we can then use these quantifiable approaches to really build up those data sets and analyze exactly the composition of these cores. And there has been an emerging literature base in recent years where more and more cores, more and more sites have been studied in the literature to build up similar peat geochemical patterns. And we're starting to see similar trends, not just in the UK, but also widely across Europe, across parts of Canada, America, and beyond. And we're seeing very similar patterns where we're seeing lots of different peatlands showing this increase, this peak towards the top of the core, which generally is accrued during the last 100 years or so. So this figure here is taken from a paper that was published by Jody Newman last year in Environmental Pollution, and shows 3 different peatlands in Ontario, Canada, in a transect, and it looked at pollution from smelting metals and anthropogenic pollutants. Now, the reason I put this figure in here is because it really clearly demonstrates one of the intricacies and difficulties in identifying where this layer of increased pollution may occur within a peat core. So on the left 2 examples, these 2 sites, it's very much happening in the very topmost peats in this column, in this peat core. But on the right-hand side, we're seeing a difference in the peat accumulation rate, and therefore the peak of pollution is actually further down, even though temporally it has occurred roughly the same period of time. It's generally occurred since the 1890s. So in this case, the peatland on the right has since buried this layer of increased pollution with new peat accumulation, which is comparatively less contaminated. So there's not just a need to quantify the spatial distribution of pollutants, but also the vertical deposition, because this has implications for how vulnerable this layer, this contaminated layer of peat, may be to release. It's also been clear from sort of our early literature analysis that previous studies have generally focused on a number of key elements that are particularly harmful or particularly well known to be deposited in peatlands. So there's been a lot of research on lead and mercury, for example, but there's a range of other elements that are also of interest and also produced by industrial activities, which we are wanting to study in this project. And so we really feel that there's a need for a global scale, comprehensive and standardized analysis of a wide range of elements in the same manner across a large number of cores to really build up a stock take of where pollution is in our global peatlands. And if we just take these few core-based examples and we assume that they are representative of the wider site, then if we start to look at these very well-known maps of global peatland distribution, we may have quite a worrying problem on our hands, whereby our global peatlands, many of which are close to industrial hotspots and sources of anthropogenic pollution, may have actually accumulated over a long period of time, gradually accumulated a vast pollution stock. And at present, it's uncertain exactly how big this pollutant stock is, but given the extent peatlands cover, it could be a vast scale, and the changes that we're seeing in our peatlands are really worrying. Now, counter to that is that the distribution is not going to be straightforward. It's not going to be a homogeneous distribution across all of our global peatlands. A number of factors will cause variation in the deposition of pollutants from pollutant sources. So, for example, atmospheric circulation patterns can determine whether pollutants are released in one direction or another based on prevailing wind patterns, for example. The pollutant characteristics themselves can determine where pollutants are deposited in peatlands. So certain heavy metals such as copper are more likely to be deposited very close to a source than mercury, which is more likely to be deposited much further and can be deposited at large distances from the actual source. And lastly, as I've shown, there's peatland type and characteristics which can affect the vertical distribution of pollutant deposition and also preservation of pollutants within peatlands. So that's why there's a need to really quantify this analytically. We can't predict this. It's very, very difficult to predict where and how much and the extent to which pollutants may be in our global peatlands. So we really need to take an observational evidence-based approach to really quantify this. And that represents the first part of our PIPES project. Now, once we know where pollutants are stored in peatlands and where the hotspots may be found, the second part of the problem to try and understand how much of an issue this is to understand, okay, what's the risk of release of any pollutants that may be stored in our peatlands? Again, there is a lot of uncertainty relating to the release mechanisms. So just at the bottom here, I've just highlighted this key point that Colin McCarter made in a paper that was published last year, which is very much a call to action, stating that there's not just a lack of literature regarding the distribution of legacy pollutant stocks globally, but there's also a relatively limited understanding of the remobilization and release pathways of pollutants. So we know that there are a range of different mechanisms that can cause pollutants to be released. Even if we just take the most pressing and most obvious, which is fire and burning, there's different types of fire. And so we can have different types of burn, from very shallow flaming burns to deeper, longer lasting smouldering burns. Also, the peat properties will determine differences in burn duration and how and how damaging these burns will be, and what quantity of pollution will be released from these peatlands. And then we've got a range of other pathways which are perhaps less obvious. So climate change is potentially driving increased flash flooding and intense hydrological flows, which can not just erode surface peats, but can also flush through groundwater flows, which can release pollutants from deeper in the peat column. And conversely, drought is increasing our risk of aeolian erosion and increasing the risk of export of peat into our local watercourses. So there's these range of different pathways, and at the moment there's a very limited and sort of experimental understanding of how each process directly contributes to the release of different pollutants at different regional and spatial scales. So this is the sort of second component of our analysis. We want to understand not just where the pollutants are, but also how, what.
So that's the general context, and yeah, that's the context to set up our research questions. So this is an overview now of our project pipes, pollutants in peatlands from sink to source. So as I've said, we really want to identify global pollutant hotspots and then improve understanding of potential release and transport mechanisms. We're using a two-pronged approach, a combination of observational core-based evidence and manipulative experimental analyses to address two key research questions. What is the content and distribution of pollutants in global peatlands? And what conditions and subsequently by what pathway would ultimately lead to their release?
Sorry. There we go, right. Okay, sorry about that. So our global inventory. Sorry, right. Our global inventory. So we want to build up a global inventory of cores. So we're looking at cores which are the top 50 centimeters of peat from top 50 centimeters of peat. Sorry, I'm not really sure when my computer's playing up here. There we go, right. Can you still hear me okay, Emma?
Yeah, I can hear you. You dropped out momentarily on a previous
sure.
slide. Okay here.
Sure, sorry, I've just realized that. No, not sure why. Anyway, we'll carry on. Sorry about that. So
I'll let you know. I'll let you know if you drop out properly.
Sure, brilliant, thank you. Yeah, so the general gist is, for the first research question, we're wanting to understand the content and distribution of pollutants in our global peatlands. To do that, we're building up a global data set of near surface peat cores, so the top 50 centimeters of peat from the surface. And we're trying to build up a database that is as balanced as possible, so as spatially representative as possible. We are analyzing our cores for the elemental composition of our cores and taking pollutant stocks from 3 different depth intervals. And this is very much driven by our process-based understanding. So we're wanting to take 3 different stock measurements of elemental composition to try and keep this analysis relatively simple, but then replicated across a large number of sites. So we want to understand what's the elemental composition of the top 50 centimeters of our peats, and then what's the composition in the top 20 centimeters, which would represent a shallow burn scenario, and from 20 to 50 centimeters depth, which is a deep burn scenario. We are then also sampling each of our sites in triplicate to give us some understanding of the within site variation that might occur in heterogeneity within our sites. I've listed on here a few of the target determinants that we're doing. So we're taking very basic measurements of peat properties, so bulk density and organic matter composition, determined by loss on ignition. We're then measuring the total content, but also the chemical speciation of a range of heavy metals and metalloids, which are listed on the screen here. And so we're also trying to understand which proportion of each of these elements is exchangeable, reducible, oxidizable, and the residual component, to try and give us an early understanding of how accessible these metals would be to remobilization and release. So that's the sort of the study design and the background to this. And we have had really great uptake so far, and we're so grateful for everybody who's managed to contribute cores to our project. So currently we have a wide range of latitudinal and longitudinal coverage with our cores, ranging from the very high Arctic and continuous permafrost regions of Northwest Territories, Canada, through the discontinuous permafrost of Northern Europe into the temperate and boreal regions of Europe, and as far east as China, and then as far south as the Falkland Islands and parts of Australia. So at the moment, this is our current distribution map. These are all the cores at the moment that we've added. There's a few new cores which have literally arrived just in a few days, which yet to be added to this map. And we've got a real good broad global coverage here. We've received more than 200 cores so far, and there is still field sampling underway by some of our collaborators in some of our understudied regions. So we hope by the end of this project to have a real strong database globally that can really define a strong understanding of the pollutant stocks in our global peatlands, which will hopefully allow us to identify where the real key hotspots are for further research. The lab work has now started, and we're now preparing cores for the ICP-MS analysis that we plan to undertake to analyze these cores, and that analysis will be undertaken by our project partners, the Peat Metal group at the University of Manchester. So I would just like to mention at this point that we are still accepting core submissions, and if anyone here has any spare cores or has any plans to undertake fieldwork in any regions here which you feel are particularly undersampled, then please do get in touch with us. We'd be very interested in collaborating with you if you are interested in working with us and to help build out this sort of community-driven global peatland data set. Please let us know at this email address, pipes@qub.ac.uk, and yeah, we'd be interested in chatting with you and seeing how we can work together. So just briefly, just a couple of slides on the experimental simulations. So building off the first component of this analysis, which is looking at this global stock take of where our pollutants are globally in peatlands, we then want to run a range of controlled environmental experiments to establish how pollutants in the peat cores may be mobilized, primarily via water and atmospheric pathways. Once we have this understanding and combine it with our research question 1, this will provide the basis for a risk analysis for how likely and what risk is associated with the release of pollutants from our global peatlands. So for this purpose, we'll be using custom designed climate cabinets and exposing a range of different cores to a number of different contrasting scenarios. So to make sure that this experimental approach is representative of the large spatial gradients that are present within our global data set, we want to take cores from a number of different regions. So cores that we have from the temperate region, for example, those cores from Ireland, and also from the Arctic, from parts of Abisko in northern Sweden, because each of these different types of peatlands have very different peat properties, variation in bulk densities, vegetation type, local pollutant source, and resistance to decay. So we've got a range of different peat properties, and these contrasting biomes will allow us to understand that. We'll be exposing our cores to 3 different treatments, which I'm determining here as scenarios. So some of our cores will go into our climate warming group. So these are cores which will be exposed to projected temperatures determined by the latest generation of global climate models, the CMIP6 models, for each of the sites and regions that we're studying. A separate set of our cores will be exposed to drought scenario, whereby the cores will be allowed to drain without any additional moisture being added to the simulation. And a separate set again will be exposed to fire and burning, and these will be deep burn and smouldering scenarios. We'll then analyze the release pathways of a range of different pollutants and chemicals via waterborne releases such as flushing and pore-based release, but also atmospheric gaseous releases, particularly from the burn cycle. So that's a general overview of the experimental design of those manipulative scenarios. We're going to get started on that in the next few weeks and months, so please stay tuned to hear more about those experiments. So lastly, just to summarize and a little bit more information on how you might want to get involved if you'd like to. We know that peatlands are vital and crucial carbon sinks and a natural negative feedback in our fight against climate change. But peatlands globally may also now represent important pollutant stores since the last few decades and centuries. The release of the toxic contaminants that may be stored in these peatlands would have damaging consequences, not just for humans, but also for our ecosystems and drinking water supplies. But at present, a number of uncertainties mean that the current distribution of legacy pollutant stocks and the remobilization and release pathways and mechanisms remain relatively uncertain and understudied. PEIPS helps to address and build upon some of these uncertainties by answering the following research questions, which combine a global inventory of core-based observations with a number of manipulative experiments designed to try and improve our understanding for how pollution may be at risk of release. Taken together, this will hopefully provide the basis for a risk analysis of our global peatland pollutant store. If you are interested in getting involved with us, you can please do contact the email address that I provided earlier. As I say, we're so grateful for everybody who has contributed cores so far. It's been brilliant to see such such a strong community-led effort to bring all of these cores together from a range of different environments, and I'm really excited to see what the results have to show at the end of this. Our call for PEIPS core submissions is remaining open until December, and if you are interested, we are seeking undisturbed continuous cores of 50 centimeters depth from primarily ombotrophic peatlands. Ideally, these cores would be sampled in triplicate to enable us to understand the within-site variation and heterogeneity of pollutant stores within a site. If you are more generally interested in the project or just would like to see any future updates, please do consider following us on Twitter as well. Thank you for taking the time to listen to us today, for hearing about our project, and very much welcome any feedback or comments or suggestions that you may have, and we're happy to stick around and chat for a little bit now if you'd like to. So thank you.
Brilliant, thank you, Richard. That was great. Great to see the overview of PEIPS laid out like that. Great, thank you. So, Adam, can you stop the recording, please?
Yeah, I'm just looking for the, oh, there it is.